In July 2008, on a Greyhound bus headed for Winnipeg, Canada, a man was stabbed, decapitated, mutilated, and cannibalised in front of horrified passengers. When the perpetrator was found not to be criminally responsible for his actions, many felt they'd avoided justice, not least the victim's family. When he was later released after just 8 years of treatment, the controversy only intensified. This is what happens when untreated mental illness has deadly consequences. This is the killing of Tim McLean. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm covering today, you have asked for. A lot of you from Canada have actually said, would I cover some Canadian cases? And this has been specifically requested again and again. And I think it's going to split people's ideas regarding whether what we're going to talk about in the long term really denotes justice or otherwise. I'm sure that some of you will be on the fence, some of you will be absolutely in the ball court of saying no, justice wasn't served, and some will ultimately be saying absolutely, this is what should happen when somebody is mentally unwell and are not necessarily in control of their actions. Equally, we have to acknowledge that the loss of any family member is just catastrophic when it's in traumatic circumstances, and we always have to put ourselves in the position of being a family member and imagining what it would be like to lose somebody and maybe feel that the sentence did not actually address the reality of the loss. For those of you who are new to my channel, I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, so if you're new here, thank you for joining me. And if you like what you see, please do subscribe, leave me a comment, get involved with the live chats on a Sunday. To all of you returners, you know I adore you. If I look a bit blurry-eyed, it's because I'm on tour with my The Serial Killer Next Door tour in the UK. It's amazing because meeting you guys is just the best thing in the world. But at the same time, I am literally doing like thousands of miles a week. And sometimes I'm not even sure I know my own name anymore. And I actually mean that. Sometimes I genuinely don't think I know my own name. So let's get started with this case because it really is one of those, like I said, divides opinion. Let's go back to the 30th of July 2008. So we've got 22-year-old Tim McLean. He's on the Greyhound bus number 1170 headed for Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now, everybody who has travelled around the world and done overseas experiences, you will know that at the end of the day, the Greyhound buses are known to be one of those things that give you cheap transport and mean that you can travel all over. And it's one of those things that you just get on and assume that you're going to be safe. You know, travellers use them everywhere, and ordinary people who aren't travellers and just need to get from place to place or going to visit families, they use them. And you just assume that once you're on there, safety in numbers and everything's going to be okay. And for Tim, who's 22 years of age, that's exactly how he is going to be feeling when he's going to Manitoba. He's going to be feeling that everything's going to be absolutely fine. He'd basically been working away during the summer carnival season. He hadn't seen his family for quite a long time. So this is an individual that we're already understanding is pro-social. They work hard. They care deeply about the family because it's been a long gap between seeing them, and he's looking forward to getting home. And his girlfriend, Colleen, she's 4 months pregnant. So everything's about potential for Tim at this moment in time. He's got another part of his life about to unfold, a new chapter, a new beginning. And you can imagine as he's travelling back, he has the anticipation of seeing the people that he loves and also celebrating the new life that is going to arrive shortly. Now, Tim as a person, when I've looked at what people say about him, it's really clear he had an excellent sense of humour. And actually people said he was so funny that you would literally be crying when he was telling you jokes or talking about stories and experiences that he dealt with. And he was actually known as Joker Wild to his friends because he had a large Joker tattoo on his back. But genuinely excellent sense of humour. Those who were around him said he was really charismatic, really fun, really funny, and somebody who was a pleasure to spend time with. Now, when he got on the Greyhound bus, he was sitting towards the rear of the bus, and he was actually just one row in front of the toilet. Have to say, totally empathise with that positioning. I am the person who always goes and finds somewhere to sit near the bathrooms, because I don't know about you guys, but as you get older, it feels like things wear out and you need to be able to get to the bathroom more quickly than in previous years. Just throwing it out there, probably too much information there. But he'd sat there, he'd boarded the actual bus at 12:30 a.m. That was in Edmonton where he got on, and it was basically going to take 24 hours because it was a 1,300-kilometre journey. So understandably, he made himself comfortable, put his earphones on, and like most of us want to do in that situation, it's all about trying to sleep. Now, when the bus stops in Ericsson, this is around 5:55 p.m, several other people get on, and one of the people who gets on was 40-year-old Vince Wagwan Lee. So he gets on at that point, and essentially another four do, and this is just a normal stop. It's what we expect to do when we're on those particular Greyhound buses. They're picking up lots of people who are going on the trips to the same destinations. And another passenger who got on said that one of the things they would have said about Lee was that he was relatively agitated. They noticed his body language wasn't in keeping with how they'd expect somebody who was just relaxed and going on a journey would be. He seemed a little bit distraught, and he was actually pacing back and forth, and he was also talking to himself in Chinese. And a lot of us will see people who emit those kind of behaviours. And whenever you see somebody walking down the street talking to themselves, often you'll see a reaction of the general public, which is people move away from them, people will cross the roads, because even though some people will just generally speak out loud when they're outside and there won't be anything mentally unwell with them, for others, it can be a direct sign that they are struggling mentally. And certainly as a body language behaviour, and as their behaviour verbally, it's not something that we typically see in people who are just going about their business. And it's likely that that passenger was picking up on those unusual cues. Now, what that passenger didn't realise is this isn't an individual who's just struggling a little bit with what's going on inside his mind. He's actually a ticking time bomb. I mean, he's seriously mentally unwell. Now, Lee, as an individual, he'd grown up in northeastern China. Apparently, he was a really sickly child. He'd been born prematurely, and he was quite a slow developer. And for anybody like myself who's had a premature baby, one of the things that they constantly do is check in on the baby to make sure that the development isn't impinged, because obviously, if you're born earlier, you can have some developmental problems. And it seems like this definitely played out in early childhood. So he was quite slow developing. He also started school late. But like a lot of children who are born prem, when it gets to teenagehood, the distinguishing reality between them being a problematic developer and being a typical developer has completely closed the gap. So he flourishes as a teenager. He achieves really good grades. He studied as a computer engineer at university, obtained a Bachelor of Science degree. But the people who knew him said that there were certain characteristics about him that meant that he had some unusual behaviour. It stuck out. So first of all, he's quite reclusive, and he found it very difficult to settle. Also, he wet the bed up until he was 18. And when you think about the psychological pain of being an individual who can't control their bladder, particularly when you're looking at teenagehood and adulthood, it is really traumatic without a shadow of a doubt, because you can't go and have stayovers. Even sleeping in a dorm if you're at university could be a problem. There are all these social norms that play into us being typical in our behaviour, and when you don't necessarily fit that paradigm, it can be psychologically really upsetting. Also, people said that he had this tendency to do things like dismantle electronic equipment at home, but then he couldn't put it back together again. So has a fascination with things, but doesn't necessarily know how to manage that fascination when he's taking things apart, and that's quite destructive. And that kind of behaviour can denote that there is something troubling going on in his head, because it really doesn't make sense to completely take apart something that's electronic when you can't put it back together. But nonetheless, if there is in your mind a reasoning behind it, because maybe you're being directed to do that, then arguably you might. Also, if you have suspicious thoughts, let's say you're feeling paranoid and you're an individual who believes that electronic equipment, for example, is bugged and you can be heard by other parties listening in, that could also mean that you want to take those kind of things apart. Now, in June 2001, he ends up emigrating from China to Winnipeg, Canada. That's with his wife, Anna. And it's not easy initially, so he can't find a job in computer engineering, but he obviously needs to get by. So he ends up taking on menial work at McDonald's, Maitland Foods, and Grant Memorial Baptist Church. So obviously he wants to make a new life for himself, but it isn't as easy as just walking into a new career in a country that's foreign to you. At the end of the day, he has to think about other ways of making money, and that means there's going to be a level of stress. When you're a qualified computer engineer and essentially you're working in McDonald's, even though that's a totally good position and something that shows that you have a work ethic, it's not likely where you want to be. And the thing about stress is it exacerbates issues with mental health. So if you have fractures in your foundations anyway, then there is a consequence of additionalizing stress in your world. And so we can see that it could be that this amplifies certain problems that he's already gestating within his mind. Now, when we get to 2004, he's actually still working at the church at this point. He starts to develop schizophrenic symptoms. Now, he didn't realise they were symptoms of schizophrenia at the time. And bear in mind, he is working at a church. And when you're working at a church, if you have some kind of transcendental spiritual experience, then arguably there are a lot of reinforcers that's possible, that it could be that you're having this transformative spiritual reality occurring because of where you are. And let's think about being somebody who has a religious revelation and suddenly finds God. It happens. So that's problematic, because if he was just working at McDonald's and was starting to have these interactions with a deity, he may start thinking to himself, this maybe isn't contextual with what's happening in my reality, and maybe I have a problem. But if you are working at a church and suddenly you think that you can hear the voice of God in your head, then you have an obvious solution to what's going on, which is you convert to Christianity. And that's exactly what he does. He converts to Christianity and he's baptized. And so there is a reinforcement level as opposed to a challenge level of this atypical behavior. His wife, who he was married to at the time, she said that she did find some of his behavior disconcerting, quite strange. So he didn't sleep very well, he didn't eat properly. And again, for those of you who've ever struggled with a mental health issue or have been diagnosed with mental illness, insomnia, poor eating, all of these things play in to an individual who is struggling, because your thoughts tend to be swamped with so many ideas and so many conflicts at times. And when it comes down to eating, that comes into self-care. And often one of the first things that starts to slide when you're in mental decline is self-care. Also, she noticed things like he'd laugh at really inappropriate times and he talked to himself. But she said that even when that was playing out, because there wasn't anything grand in his behaviour, there was nothing that was so left field that it really caught her attention in a way that said, this is the person who's in trouble with their mental health. She kind of put it down to him being overtired. But when they got sleeping tablets, that didn't actually help. But again, so many of us will have been in a situation with our own mental health where it's really hard to acknowledge that there is something going on. You kind of just think it will change, you'll get over it, things will be better. And if you're in a relationship with somebody, or you have a family close connection with somebody, or you've got a friend who suddenly starts to go into mental decline, often because you have a bias in that relationship, which is that they've been okay before, and you want them to be okay, so you don't want to take it too seriously because it's scary to imagine that somebody that you love is struggling so desperately, we'll often excuse behaviours until it gets to crisis point. In fact, that's one of the big problems with mental illness. People genuinely don't get the help that they need or deserve until it gets to that point of crisis, because They haven't taken it as seriously as they need to, and the people around them haven't. And it's not just his wife who hadn't necessarily noticed anything seriously wrong. Even at work, people hadn't recognised that he was struggling. So he's considered a really hard worker, always punctual, never caused any problems whatsoever. People referred to him as a really decent, a really respectful individual. But people also acknowledged that one of the things that was a bit of a limiter in building relationships with him was he had a really strong Chinese accent, and he also talked really quickly, and that made it difficult for him to be understood at times. So I suppose we could position the idea that maybe even when or if he was struggling, people might not necessarily have noticed it because they've got used to not really understanding what he's saying. But essentially, as far as his physical actions, there was nothing that raised any alarms. In fact, one of the most recent jobs that he'd been working delivering newspapers, and again, just considered to be really good, really reliable as an employee. And when he approached his boss in Edmonton and said that he needed to take some time off, he suggested that the reason that he needed to take time off was that he needed to travel for a job interview, which was in Winnipeg. Now, his boss said to him, "How long are you going to be away? And when are you going to come back?" But apparently he'd never actually heard back from him. And before he set off, Lee had left a note for his ex-wife, Anna, which was quite concerning. So Anna and he had divorced in 2006. That was around the same time that he'd actually become a Canadian citizen. But the note that he left read, "I'm gone. Don't look for me. I wish you were happy." So understandably, there's a language barrier, so he wouldn't necessarily write perfect English, but "I'm gone. Don't look for me. I wish you were happy." It really causes concern. Whenever you see a note like that, first of all, you're concerned about whether they are thinking about potentially harming themselves. Secondly, there's something quite final. So that again suggests that somebody could be really struggling. And the fact that he's wishing her happiness, or he's saying, "I wish that you were happy," suggests again that he has strong emotional connection to the experience that he's going through in that moment in time. He's obviously got a level of grieving involved with that particular statement. So definitely if I read that as a partner or an ex-partner, I would be worried. But what can you do? At the end of the day, they were separated, they were divorced. It's not her responsibility. And even for the boss, they've asked the question, "When are you coming back?" Lee just hasn't answered. So after he's left this note, Lee ends up making his way to Edmonton bus station. It's here that he buys a ticket to Thunder Bay via Winnipeg. And he buys that ticket under the name Wong Pent, which, again, it makes you question why he's felt the need to do that. Why wouldn't he just use his own name? And that brings up the idea that maybe he's scared. Maybe he doesn't want people to know where he's gone. And clearly, the fact that he's written to his ex and said that he doesn't want them to find him, essentially, that could be another reason that he's decided, "I'm going to disappear. I'm going somewhere completely new. I don't want anybody to be able to follow me." But like I said, certainly in my experience of working with schizophrenia, I've often worked with clients who are incredibly terrified. They really are. They believe that they are being chased. They believe that they need to escape, and they are literally running for their lives. So that's another possibility. Now, as I said, he's meant to be going to Thunder Bay, but he ends up getting off the bus in Ericsson. Now, the bus driver had actually noted that he wasn't meant to be getting off in Ericsson at all, and he'd actually advised him it wasn't his stop. But in spite of this, he does get off, and then he spends the next 24 hours just waiting for the next bus, which again is really worrying behaviour. We've all made mistakes. I will say that now. I once lost a camper van for 24 hours. That is not a lie. I was in New Zealand. It was harrowing. It literally had my entire life in there. But the point is, it was a mistake, right? The reality is, I didn't have someone saying, "Emma, you're looking in the wrong car park." So I have no advice. But the point is, this individual has advice. He's being informed by the bus driver, "Do not get off. It's not your stop. And again, that kind of makes me think about fear. Why would you get off a bus when you don't know when the next bus is coming and you're probably unprepared for that situation? And the fact that somebody's trying to say, no, this isn't your stop, I think that genuinely demonstrates that there is a fear factor there. He's worried about being on that particular bus. So he's actually decided to get off. And again, I think that that's showing that bubbling of schizophrenic behaviours and the fact that there is a potential loss of control over his mental state. So he ends up sitting there all night and all the next day on a bench. And people who saw him said that he literally was sat bolt upright with his eyes wide open. Again, it's really atypical behaviour. If somebody is just sat bolt upright with your eyes wide open, staring ahead, and on top of this, it's been a long period of time, that's not how we react. Let's be honest. Any of you who've had to go and do a stopover at an airport for longer than 12 hours, they're going to find you crumpled up somewhere in a corner using your coat as a pillow. That's what we do. It's a natural inclination of human beings when we're exhausted. You just find anywhere, anything to just make into a temporary bed. You don't sit bolt upright. It's painful, agonizing, some would say, after a period of time. So again, what is he thinking? What is he looking for? Where is the fear in this moment? Because it feels like it's playing deeply into what's happening. Also, he had this sign next to him and he was basically offering his new laptop for sale for $600. Now, in the end, a boy actually buys that new laptop off him for $60. So yes, the boy gets a massive bargain, but at the end of the day, we're seeing, aren't we, that this is not what somebody who is well adjusted and coping would do. If you've just spent money on a new laptop, the last thing you're going to do is give it away for $60. And again, that makes me think that ultimately he's not really thinking about the future. He's not necessarily believing there might be one even. Now, Lee also goes ahead and disposes some of his other personal belongings by burning them. I mean, that in itself shows you that this is somebody who is either trying to escape desperately, trying to leave behind whoever they were, or feels that they're being chased potentially. Now, the boy who bought the laptop for a very, very bargain price, he actually said there was nothing particularly strange about him, aside from the fact that he was to some degree a bit emotionless and detached. Just gonna throw it out there. I think selling you the laptop that was brand new for $60, it's pretty bizarre behaviour. But there again, you're young. You don't realise this yet. You just think you got a bargain. But at the end of the day, the fact that he is doing that in that situation, in that place and space, why would you be selling it there? If you are looking in from a more professional perspective, you are going to be thinking this is really odd behaviour. And also, again, the emotionless, the detached behaviour, it suggests that there is something going on deep within him. And what everyone who's kind of walking past him at the time and seeing him at the time, they are unaware of the fact that Lee believes at this moment in time he's on a mission from God. He'd heard God speaking to him, God's voice, and he told him that he was the third story of the Bible. So for him, he believed that he was the second coming of Christ, essentially, sent to save mankind from an alien invasion. That was what he believed he'd been told. And in his mind, aliens were around us and among us, but they looked human. So only he could tell them apart. And this is why he'd started to travel the country, because he wanted to document his journey, because he believed that God had actually been advising him that he had to write his exodus down. And it turned out that before he'd gone on this trip, he'd often disappeared for days at a time. In fact, 3 years earlier, he'd been found wandering down a highway towards Winnipeg. And he'd actually told the authorities he was following the sun, and he was following the sun at the command of God. Now, when that happened, unsurprisingly, they were very concerned about him, so he ended up getting hospitalised. And they recorded that when he was hospitalised, he was in an uncommunicative and catatonic state. So for those of you who don't know what catatonic means, it basically means that you could just be sat and you might not move at all. So you're aware of what's going on a lot of the time, but you are almost a statue within your reality. It's at this point that he ends up getting diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was given medication, but he'd basically been in absolute denial. He'd really been unwilling to accept that he was ill, and he hadn't taken his meds. Now, from my personal experience working with schizophrenics, I will tell you that it is not uncommon at all for people to really struggle accepting that they are ill. Because imagine hearing a voice that is as present as your partner in the room. Imagine that voice seemingly making sense and directing you and advising you of what you need to do. Imagine that voice being so powerful that it can convince you, even though it feels like a separate entity, that you are somebody who is here to save the world, and that anybody around you who tries to get in the way is basically on the side of evil. And you need to ignore all of that and instead concentrate on what your main mission in life is. I've worked with schizophrenics who believe there are brain-sucking machines in the room. I have worked with people who have written their own languages because they're too afraid that other people are going to be able to look in their journals and see what they've actually said. I've worked with individuals who genuinely believe that they are being advised that literally aliens are everywhere and they can hear every thought, and it's absolutely real for them. So a lot of people do struggle when they're diagnosed that there is anything really going on about their mental decline, and instead they believe that all those people trying to suggest it are actually in on the gig, and they're trying to confuse them as well and trying to knock them off whatever their particular reality is about finding and forging this way forward and taking the advice that they've been given by these voices, in this case, that God's speaking to him and telling him it's the second coming and that he's here to essentially protect mankind from these aliens. Now, he doesn't take his meds, and again, that's quite common. It's why some people who are schizophrenic will actually have to be injected every few weeks as opposed to taking tablets, because they can't be trusted to take the tablets. Again, not because they're bad people, not at all, just because they're really suspicious and paranoid and they believe they've potentially been being poisoned or controlled. So he's in that situation. So he ends up at this point buying himself a really large buck knife, and that's essentially for protection from aliens and also for protection from forces of evil whilst he's on his travels, and he carries that everywhere. So again, that idea about fear, he's perpetually feeling that fear, and if he's perpetually feeling that fear, he's perpetually feeling that stress, and those two together are not good bedfellows when we're dealing with a mental illness. Now, initially, when Lee gets on the bus, he sits towards the front. There's 36 passengers on board at that particular point. Now, when the bus stopped, and it stopped between Brandon and Portage la Prairie, several passengers got off. They went and had a cigarette, they went and stretched their legs, and this actually included Tim and Lee. Now, when he got back on board, Lee moved from his seat near the front and actually goes to the back of the bus, and he takes the empty aisle seat next to Tim. Now, according to others who were on the bus, they said, look, Tim just wasn't even concentrating on anything around him apart from listening to his music, trying to get some sleep. He had his headphones on, he's listening to his iPod, head was against the window, just trying to zone out. It's a long journey. Sure, he was exhausted. He just wanted a peaceful trip. When the bus sets off again, at this moment in time, it seems okay. So a lot of the passengers are sleeping, others are watching Zorro on the coach TV, but within a few seconds of the coach starting off again, and just as the bus is travelling on the Trans-Canada Highway, this is through Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, everything changed. Now, everything changed as far as Lee was concerned because he was convinced he heard God, and God commanded him to kill Tim. He told him that Tim was a force of evil. And he also apparently informed Lee that if he didn't kill Tim, Tim would kill him and the others. So approximately 8:30 p.m, and bear in mind, this is absolutely without warning. There is no prelude. There is no antagonistic behaviour. There is no escalation. There is no argument. There is nothing at all. Just out of the blue, Lee suddenly produces that large knife that he was carrying, which was always on a sheath on his side. And he turns to the completely unsuspecting Tim, who's just wearing earphones, totally unaware that Lee is having these delusions. And Lee starts to just repeatedly stab Tim in the neck, in the chest. Now, other passengers immediately start realising there's this really odd situation unfolding, then come to the harsh and horrific realisation that something is horrifically wrong when they hear Tim's blood-curdling screams. That's how his screams were described. They were blood-curdling. And those screams were so horrific, so blindsiding, so totally out of the ordinary, and so extraordinarily gruesome that some of the passengers who were on that particular coach remain haunted by the sounds of them years and years later. Now, initially, bear in mind, Tim was not prepared. He's not had an opportunity to defend himself. So when he comes to the realisation that somebody's stabbing him, he tries to fend off the attacker, but it's completely hopeless. He's trapped. He's in his seat against the window, and that makes defence really challenging. He's the one caged in, and he's the one being attacked by a large knife, by a man who was prepared in that moment to do what he thought he was being told to do, which was to kill Tim. Now, witnesses later described that it was one of the most terrifying things they'd ever seen, but what made it totally disturbing to the max was that it wasn't frenzied. It wasn't out of control. They said that Lee was like a robot, and that when he was stabbing Tim, he was completely emotionless, just acting in a way, in a robotic fashion. And even though nobody's prepared ever to see somebody get stabbed in this way, when you think about the intimate reality of a stabbing crime, it's quite personal. It's why we often see it in crimes of passion, because there's an intimate space and you're like looking at the person as you're taking their life. But the idea of somebody just stabbing systematically and emotionless, that is so outside of the realms of what we expect, even when we're dealing with a situation that's so totally out of the realms that we expect. Now, the passenger who's sitting directly opposite Lee, they see the attack basically unfold. So obviously they want to get help. They run to the front of the bus, they tell the driver what's happening, and then panic just blows up, it erupts. Other passengers start screaming, they start running to the front of the bus because all they're thinking about is, oh my God, there is a madman on this coach stabbing an innocent individual to death, and it could be them next. That's the normal reaction. Now, Bruce Martin's driving the bus at the time, and he pulls it over straight away. He opens the door and then he shouts at Lee to stop. But Lee is in a completely different zone, a different mental dimension. So he just completely ignores him, just continues to, in an emotionless state, gruesomely stab Tim, who's now on the floor of the bus, really mortally wounded. The passengers are just trying to get off because they are terrified. And it's at this point that Lee actually tries to exit the vehicle as well. Now, bear in mind, he's still armed with a knife. Bruce, at this point, managed to close the door on his knife arm, and then Lee pulls it back inside. Bruce, at this point, calls the police. And it must be very, very difficult to be in a situation like that. Because on one level, you want to protect Tim. He's obviously been horribly wounded by what seems to be a mad knife man. And at the same time, you have all these other passengers that you are in charge of caring for, and you want to get them to safety. And you don't want the person with the knife to be in a crowd of unarmed people because they could do more damage. But equally, it must be challenging for Bruce to manage the fact that Tim was left by himself in such a horrendous state. I imagine that's caused a huge amount of trauma for him. Now, a lorry driver, a guy called Chris Algery, he'd actually pulled over at this point to offer assistance because he'd obviously sensed that something might be wrong. I guess at the end of the day, they thought that something potentially had gone wrong with the bus. And also another Greyhound bus driver, a guy called Bernie Skirrup, he'd also pulled over. And like I said, I imagine in the first instance, they were just pulling over because there were people off the bus and it looked like there was some kind of issue happening. Now, Chris brought a hammer with him, also a crowbar, to actually use as a weapon. So at this point, he, Bruce and Bernie, they get on the bus because they want to help Tim, which is unbelievably brave. I mean, the fact that they don't want to just leave this poor, helpless, innocent man and they want to try to save him and they take their own lives in their own hands, that says something really powerful about these individuals. Now, they get on that bus, they approach Lee, and instantly they can see that he isn't finished with his victim. And I guess at this moment in time as well, they realise there was genuinely nothing that they'd be able to do for Tim because Lee was in the process of decapitating him. So at this point, they know that, to be honest, they're going to be putting themselves at risk and they won't be able to protect Tim. So it's better to exit the bus. And that's what they do. And also at this point, Lee's threatening them with a knife. So they could be at serious risk. So they end up guarding the door because they don't want him to escape. Can you imagine the scene unfolding? The passengers who are now on the roadside just absolutely confused and traumatized, dealing with something that's from their worst nightmares, knowing that this young man has lost his life and there's nothing they can do, and that this guy who is clearly not in his right mind or is a massively dangerous murderer, either way equally terrifying, is still armed and dangerous. And they can actually see that Lee is stabbing the knife repeatedly into Tim's body. I mean, what's transpired has been bad enough, but you can imagine them watching that and it's going to get worse. Things are going to get even more horrific because Lee suddenly stands up, walks down to the bus doors and holds up Tim's severed head to the other passengers. There was just absolute hysteria. Everyone was traumatized beyond belief. Some people were physically sick. And then they watch him as he just returns and carries on mutilating Tim's body and cutting parts of Tim's body off. And this is playing out in real time. And yet those people witnessing it must have imagined that they were just living in their worst nightmare, just hoping that somebody would pinch them and that they would wake up. But they weren't going to wake up because this was reality, even though it sounds so far away from what we expect when we're thinking about what reality is for the vast majority of us. Now, at one of the points during this period of time, Lee actually does try to escape through the doors, and Lee then, because he can't escape through the doors, decides that he's going to try to drive the bus away. Fortunately, again, the driver's quick thinking stops it, so he's able to immobilise the bus from the outside. And then Lee goes back to just wandering around with Tim's severed head, and then intermittently going back to the body to mutilate it. So the dehumanisation is occurring, and obviously we see the chaos that's unfolding. We see the randomness of the attack as well. We see a man who is clearly in some kind of mental decline and distress. And the fact that he keeps going back to the body again and causing it to look less and less like a human, that reminds me of what we see in disorganised offenders and the way that they kill, because they just try to eradicate the humanity. Bear in mind, at this moment in time, apparently he's convinced that Tim was an alien. So trying to remove parts of who Tim really is as the beautiful human he was, that makes it easier for Lee to confirm that what he's done is correct. Potentially. That's the way that I see this interaction going down. We get to about 9 p.m, bear in mind, the police have been called, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrive on the scene. So these are the big guns. These are individuals who know what they're going to do in this situation. They also bring a special negotiator and also a heavily armed tactical unit, because we all know how it goes. You get the negotiator. Hopefully that person's going to be able to speak some sense into the individual, because they don't know. Could be a terrorist attack. Could be an individual who is just interested in murdering people. Could be somebody who's really severely mentally unwell. And the negotiator's job is to figure that out and hopefully help them to make a decision that means they don't have to kill that person. Because arguably, the reason the armed tactical unit there is there purely because they want to know that if the worst comes to the worst, Lee is going to be leaving in a body bag and nobody else is going to get killed. At this point, they get the surviving passengers to a safe location, and then it's a 5-hour standoff with Lee. He's just refusing to leave the bus, and during this period of time, again, he's just going back to Tim's body. He's stabbing him, he's mutilating him, and some of the officers actually witnessed him consuming pieces of Tim's flesh. And at one of the points, some of the officers heard him say, "I have to stay on this bus forever." Now, finally, Lee does actually get apprehended. It's around 1:30 a.m, but not because the negotiator has worked his magic, no. What he actually did was he smashed the bus window and he ended up jumping out head first. And at this point, they just kind of multiply attack him with the tasers because they need to make sure that they can subdue him. And when people are in states of mass agitation, or if they're in a psychotic episode, I have experienced this when my father was alive and he went through a period of very sad psychosis, which is very challenging to see because obviously it's incredibly distressing for the person enduring it and it's incredibly distressing for you. He had super strength. I cannot describe it. Super strength. My husband, my brother, the police, the ambulance drivers, they literally struggled to contain him. They had to give him so much basic sedative that it nearly killed him. It nearly stopped him breathing. But that's how much they needed to give him because the mental agitation overtook the physical being. And the fact that he tries to get out head first says he's clearly not thinking about personal injury. I mean, throwing yourself out of a bus window head first is going to end badly for you on the whole. And those tasers finally do actually subdue him. They're able to then arrest him. And then the officers have to go and deal with the absolute horror, which is going and finding Tim's mutilated remains. And even for the officers who have been to murder scenes and have dealt with some pretty traumatic material, this is really one of those scenes that affects them and continues to affect many of them. Because when they find Tim's mutilated body, it's obvious straight away that several of his facial features have literally been removed from his severed head. When they look in Lee's pocket, they actually find a plastic bag, and in that plastic bag, they find Tim's nose, ear, tongue. And what's even more disturbing is with respect, when they try to kind of piece together his remains, there's literally no trace of Tim's eyes or of part of his heart. Now, I will tell you that Lee fervently denied that he'd actually done anything with them, but it's assumed, and obviously appropriately and accurately assumed, that he had cannibalised them. And that's what people had been witnessing when they'd seen him going back to the body and looking like he was ingesting the organs. So this is something that is so atypical. You know, even in these kind of terrible circumstances, you don't expect cannibalism. Now, when Lee is arrested, he's initially charged with second-degree murder. And at his first court hearing, apparently he actually only said 3 words. He said, "Please kill me." So again, you kind of think about where Lee is mentally at this moment in time and the fact that the world is clearly a very overwhelming and scary place and he's asking to be put out of his misery to some degree. And maybe as well, there is a small shred of reality and conscience playing in, and the enormity of what's played out could also be affecting him. So the "please kill me" could be a sense of people need justice and I've done this horrible thing, so please get rid of me from this planet. We then get to the 5th of March 2009, and even though he's been charged with second-degree murder, when they do psychiatric assessments on him, they are able to pretty quickly established that Lee had been suffering from schizophrenia. So accordingly, the judge in this case said that he wasn't criminally responsible for Tim's killing. He said that Tim had been killed during a psychotic break, and because he was under this massive delusion, he at the time didn't believe that what he was doing was morally wrong. In fact, as far as he was concerned, at the time he was protecting other people and he was essentially acting in self-defense. So he had this delusion in his mind that he had to murder Tim and mutilate Tim because he didn't want him to come back to life. And so the judge was basically saying, because he didn't understand his actions, and at the time he didn't think those actions were wrong, you couldn't criminally hold him responsible. And that's a fundamental principle of Canadian law. And that principle has been there since 1992. Now, I know that when you go into the States, into America, often you won't get the same kind of leniency when it comes down to mental illness, because many cases have involved people who have been in what would be considered a state of massive mental decline, but they have still been held criminally responsible for what they've done. Now, people, when they found out that he wasn't being considered responsible for these utterly horrific acts, and that meant that he wasn't going to serve a prison sentence, they felt absolutely outraged. They felt that this is a murder, plain and simple. At the end of the day, he may not have exactly known what he was doing, but what he did is so despicable, and the pain that it's caused and the ripple effect it has for generations in that family is so horrific that it is deserving of a proper sentence. And Tim's mother, Carol Dedeli, who would obviously feel totally devastated when people start talking about this guy being mentally ill and therefore not being responsible for what he did to her son, somebody that she absolutely adored, she said he should be held responsible for it. He still did it. Whether he was in his right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There was nobody else on that bus holding a knife, slicing up my child. And even though I am somebody who's worked in mental health for many, many years, I'm also a mother. And if somebody had literally hacked my child to pieces, whether they believed they were an alien or otherwise, I would feel really conflicted, really angry. And like my child's death had not been given a legacy of justice, if the person who'd actually caused it was given a license to have an easier ride than somebody who was apparently in their right state of mind. Because I can understand there is a complete distinction between being a professional and being a human being who's lost a child. A child is the love of your life, and to have to carry the pain, the anguish, the future without them, that's something that is just intolerable. I will say, at the same point, Lee was definitely mentally ill at the same time as the killing, without a doubt. And he was somebody who hadn't received the treatment that he needed or hadn't taken the treatment that he needed seriously. And at the end of the day, this is what has played out. He was certainly in a very distressed, mentally unwell time. And that means under law, and particularly in Canada, and it's the same in the UK with respect, they consider that you need treatment rather than punishment. And that by treating the illness, you essentially return the humanity that has been struggling because of the fact that they have been convinced of all these awful things. In this case, that the world is full of aliens that need extinguishing and executing to protect humanity. So they basically take him into a hospital. And I would say that even though we can all appreciate that's the right treatment, what happens over the next few years causes more outrage. And again, I do actually have sympathy and empathy with the outrage. So first of all, people felt that his recovery and the freedom that that recovery brought happened really fast. So Lee initially is sent to Manitoba's Selkirk Mental Health Centre, which is a psychiatric facility. And this is because they need to treat him for his schizophrenia. They prescribe him olanzapine, and that's an antipsychotic for those of you who don't know. So obviously it's there to help address the issue with his psychosis. And when they prescribe him olanzapine, he starts to make relatively good progress. After just a year of treatment, he's actually able to walk around the hospital grounds with 2 staff. Then just 2 years later, this is in 2012, he's able to venture out into the surrounding community of Selkirk with a staff member and a security officer. So he's getting these opportunities to be essentially nearly free. Initially, it's only for like 30 minutes, but then it increased to full days. And bear in mind, this is during a period that, yes, he's mentally unwell, but we're still dealing with a reality that he's murdered somebody and he's just out in the community, albeit supported by staff. But we've already seen the kind of things that he can do. It doesn't necessarily mean that those staff are safe or that the individuals in the community are safe. Now, in the following year, the area that he's allowed to visit increases. So he's allowed to go to nearby Lockport and Winnipeg, and then he's allowed to actually walk the hospital grounds unaccompanied. And by 2014, that's just 6 years after he's horrifically murdered Tim, he's permitted to go out into the community completely by himself. And back in the hospital, he's now put on an unlocked ward. So by the next year, after this, when he's been living a relatively free life, preparations begin to make Lee get reintroduced into society. And it was recommended by his doctors that he be allowed to travel unaccompanied to Winnipeg and actually moved to an unsecure hospital there. The whole point of this is because they wanted to then move him into a community group home. He was, I would say, considered to be a really model patient. So he was somebody who didn't cause the staff any problems. And you can imagine, when we're talking about people who are in secure units and then reduced back into the community, there are often periods of real hostility, conflict, amplification of behaviour that's problematic, and Lee doesn't really exhibit that. So I can understand that they'll have a bias towards him based on the fact that compared to other patients, he isn't problematic. But I also can see that concerned parties would say, well, before he killed Tim on a coach, no one was really noticing that his behaviour was problematic there. So when you think about him contextually as a human being, even when he was in massive mental decline, no one actually noticed. So I understand why people were outraged by this. So eventually he gets discharged into the community. There are conditions associated, as you would expect. So some of the conditions were that he had to take his medication under supervision. Another one was that he had to disclose his address to his medical team. Yes, just going to throw it out there. You would think it's a bare minimum you'd have to take your medication and let your supervision team know where you lived. Otherwise, how could you be treated? Just going to throw it out there. Do we even need these written in? These should just be absolute stalwarts forever when an individual has done what he's done. And I mean that, forever. This guy should be supervised forever. Also, he was told that he wasn't allowed to have any contact with Tim's family. Yes, again, shouldn't even need saying. But at the end of the day, they seem quite a low bar, expectation-wise, for conditions when you think about what we've been talking about. You know, where's the must never have access to knives, must never own a gun? These are kind of clear additions that should absolutely be on any kind of agreement. We get to February 2017, so this is less than 9 years after the killing, and he's got a new name. Obviously, the thing about Lee is they know that if people know who he is, that could cause him a problem and prevent progress. But again, it must be really galling to be a family member and think this individual is just allowed to get on with their life and people won't know what he did. So his new name is Will Lee Baker, and Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board actually grant Lee an absolute discharge with no restrictions. Now, look, you all know, because you watch me regularly, and you know the absolute empathy I have with mental health issues. I spent my career working in it. I lost my dad to it. So there is no doubt whatsoever that I empathise and sympathise with people who are struggling with mental health. And even when people do things as horrific as this, I can have empathy and sympathy for that reality. But what are Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board doing, saying he has an absolute discharge with no restrictions? That means no restrictions, as in literally no guidance. They said that they didn't consider Lee to pose a significant threat to the public. And therefore, apparently, they were obliged to make the decision that was the least onerous on the patient. And in this case, they said that was an absolute discharge. Even though they say that, the board also stressed that public safety was paramount. Sorry, can we just really have a common sense, logical conversation? I think this guy, who has refused to take medication before, who has decapitated an innocent man on a coach, who threw himself head first out of said coach and cannibalised the victim thinking he was an alien. I'm throwing it out there that you, if you put no restrictions on him whatsoever, will not be aware as to whether he's taking his medication that could mean he spirals into a scenario where we see a repeat of this. Yeah, but we just think it's a really low risk. I don't know whether you need to rewind my conversation and then replay it 6,000 times until it sinks in, but why is this low risk? Why? Low risk when controlled, low risk when supervised, low risk when consistently monitored, and when everyone's aware of where this individual is. Low risk. The minute you let him out, he's not necessarily low risk, is he? Just these things are problematic, not just for people who may be in danger should a decline happen. It's dangerous for him. We have to remember that Lee has struggled enormously. He could be a threat to himself. So this is twofold. This is about a community who can be affected, an individual who could find themselves in a similar situation to Tim, and also Lee, who may end up doing something dangerous to himself. But even though they say that this is the reality in the past and that public safety is paramount, apparently they think his reoffending risk is really low. So just to put it out there, guys, that decision means he's 100% free. No agency supervision to ensure he's taking the medication. They just have to trust that he'll go ahead and do it, even though prior to the killing, he'd literally been living with untreated schizophrenia, had denied he was ill, and had refused to take meds. And later he went on to believe that he was on a mission from God to save the human race from aliens, and on top of that, had brutally killed, decapitated, mutilated, and cannibalised an innocent man. All the while not recognising that he was ill. What could possibly go wrong? I despair, genuinely. And that is not because I'm being disrespectful to Lee and his mental health. I am being reasonable and suggesting there is a potential risk. And if there is a potential risk, and there is a remedy to that risk being supervision and mandated medication under supervision, and hopefully just supervision on a reasonable amount of levels so that people can see if he's struggling with his mental health, how can that not be seen as essential in this situation? How can that not be seen as essential to Tim's family members who have to live with the fact that the killer of their much loved relative is basically free to live their life and make choices, even if some of those choices involve, for example, not taking the medication anymore? The problem is, Lee's not cured. Lee is not cured at all. What's happened is he's got a condition, and that condition is being treated, and that condition is being managed. So the supervision is required because you need that to take medication. You need that so you don't become a threat to public safety. It is nonsensical. It is absolutely inappropriate, dangerous, in fact, to have withdrawn all those safeguards. Those safeguards are about protecting the public and also keeping Lee well. Can you imagine being Tim's mother? And understandably, it's absolutely broken Carol, Tim's mother's heart. She said, Vince Lee got help. Good for him. Maybe he's feeling better today. My son's dead. What if he chooses not to take his medications? We all know what he's capable of. You have to have a complete sympathy with her. She's absolutely correct. You know, she's not denying the fact that Lee has got help, or even that Lee may be able to go on and live a good life. She's questioning the fact that the organisations around him that are meant to protect the public are not necessarily applying the efficacy required to keep people safe. And if you knew that you were living next door to somebody who'd literally cannibalised and cut the head off some random innocent man, and no one was checking in on him, well, I'd move. And that's not because I don't have a sympathy and empathy with mental health. I do. I've lived it. I've lost because of it. But I know that I protect my children above any other cost. And the idea that I wouldn't even know, so I have my choice taken away from me, that this person in my locality working at my office, if I don't know, then you're removing my options. And I know that people will say, but that means that he would be stigmatized. Yes, it would. But unfortunately, in those circumstances, the stigma exists because he killed somebody. And we have to understand that whilst everyone has human rights, and you cannot have more empathy than I with mental illness, I get it. But still, other people deserve to at least be aware of a potential risk, particularly if somebody's behaviour starts to change and no one knows because no one's been informed. Because there are no conditions attached to his release. If he wanted to, he could literally go and pay Tim's family a visit, which is just awful for them to think. And I'm not having to go at Lee. Listen, when it comes down to the reoffending rates, for people like Lee, it's really low. So about 7% of individuals that carry out horrific crimes in these circumstances reoffend. It's really, really low. And that is a massive difference to when you think about people being released from federal prison, because they believe the reoffending rate there is over 40%. So massive difference. But nonetheless, happens 7% of the time. And we need to approach risk in this way. Now, I fear what would happen if Lee stopped taking his meds. You know, if he stops taking them and then reoffends, would he actually be considered not criminally responsible because he'd not taken his meds and therefore his mental illness had arrived again? Or now, would he actually be considered at fault because, you know, he knows he's meant to take his meds and he didn't? Because that again makes him in a more dangerous situation. If he was being supervised, then people would be able to look in and say, okay, Lee, you need to do A, B, or C. And then he's not necessarily being given this level of control that at times he's not able and prepared for. Because when you are schizophrenic, it is so scary. And you genuinely can go into this situation of decline and believe that the world around you is the most terrifying place. And you can have these delusions that are so real for you. So like I said, this isn't me having a go at Lee. It's me having a go at the system that's meant to protect Lee and people like you and I. Tim's mother feels that her son and her family have literally been denied justice. She feels that the rights of the killer have taken precedence over the rights of his victim. And she's actually fighting for a change in Canadian law. And that change that she wants would mean that killers who are mentally ill would remain in a secure treatment facility for life. And certainly when you compare the Canadian law to the law in the States, we have covered lots of cases where people are literally locked up in secure units for life, because even though they may be well and be in a secure psychiatric facility coping, the consideration is that their rights are usurped by the rights of the individual who they killed and the families of those individuals. So there will be lots of people who agree with that. Now, at present, according to reports, Lee is living independently in a Manitoba community. Apparently is not required to attend annual reviews or abide by the Criminal Code Review Board's conditions. So he's just out there getting on with his life, with his new name, and absolutely no supervision. Now, this is a really difficult case. It absolutely is. Because when you think about it, strictly speaking, Lee was no longer ill when he was released. So it is quite difficult on one level to justify keeping him held for an act that he wasn't actually criminally responsible for. And actually, technically, that means he wasn't actually a criminal. But even though it would seem, shall we say, really unreasonable to keep him locked up forever, it also seems completely unreasonable to have just given him an absolute discharge. You know, given what he is capable of and has proven to be capable of during a psychotic break, come on. Some kind of supervision should absolutely have been necessary, if only to ensure that he takes his meds and never becomes a threat to the public again. And the thing is, when we talk about Tim being a victim, he wasn't the only victim that day. Yes, he was the victim who bore the most violence and who lost his life. But several of the passengers who witnessed that horrific death, they all suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. That includes the lorry driver who actually stopped to help and ended up witnessing the decapitation. He found it incredibly difficult to sleep afterwards, started to self-medicate, became an alcoholic. So that's a life wrecked. Then in 2011, two of the passengers who'd been on board, they actually brought this multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Vince Lee and also Greyhound buses, the RCMP and the government. But whilst it failed, it just shows that the damage that they felt, they wanted some kind of reparation. And meanwhile, on top of all of this, one of the first police officers on the scene, Corporal Ken Barker of the RCMP, he took his own life in 2014. His family said that he suffered such horrendous PTSD that he was literally never able to get past what he saw that day. So all those lives affected, one life lost, another ruined by alcoholism, all because of the actions of Vince Lee. Now, Lee was also a victim to some degree. And he's somebody who's expressed a lot of remorse for his actions. He stated that he did remember what had happened on the bus, and he actually can't believe that the police didn't kill him. He believes that the police should have killed him, in fact. But he also notes that he's glad that they didn't. He says that he knows exactly what he did and that his actions were unforgivable. They were atrocious, and that he will live his life not just regretting his actions, but he will never ever forgive himself for what he did. He also said that he doubts he'll ever feel any happiness again. And that, I would say, is something that he will obviously incur. But I also guess that when you think about Tim's family, that's how they feel. They'll absolutely never feel the pure happiness that they did have when Tim was alive. I also think it goes without saying, but I'm going to just state it anyway, that when it comes down to the vast majority of people who suffer from schizophrenia or individuals who have psychotic breaks, they're all law-abiding individuals. They would never dream, conceive of hurting another person. And the truth is, statistically, they are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. So I want it to be clear that we are not saying that if you have schizophrenia, you are going to become somebody who murders innocent bystanders. That just isn't the reality. But when we're dealing with cases like this, very occasionally a statistical anomaly occurs and somebody who is diagnosed with schizophrenia and has a horrendous psychotic break that has gone under the radar for a period of time can pose a threat to the public. But like I said, when it comes down to schizophrenia per se, it's incredibly rare. I have worked with many schizophrenics who've harmed themselves, and during the terrifying experience of feeling that they can trust no one, they have felt that the only opportunity is to remove themselves from this earth. And we always have to have total sympathy and empathy for people who are struggling this way and do all we can to help them. There's actually a memorial for Tim, and it stands at the spot where the bus pulled over on that really fateful day. And then at his grave, the family placed solar lights. And they did that because they never wanted him to be in darkness. Now, what's really sad about this case, aside from the fact that this innocent man lost his life, we have to remember Tim's girlfriend was 4 months pregnant. And 5 months after his death, that's in December 2008, a little boy was born, his son. And even though that boy will be surrounded in love, he'll never get a chance to know his father. He'll never get an opportunity to know how funny he was, how he could make people cry with laughter, how adored he was by everybody, because he's never going to get to see that in action. And even though I have no doubt that Tim's mother and family and his girlfriend will talk often and fondly about what an incredible human being he was denied the opportunity to hold that little boy for the first time, to see him take his first steps, speak his first words, to hear the words, "I love you, Daddy." All the things that every single new parent absolutely knows they'll relish. It's a horrendous reality that Tim McLean got on a Greyhound bus, headed for Winnipeg, and never arrived at his destination. And like I said, even though I have a total understanding of the reality of the mental illness that Lee experienced, I cannot understand how any board, any authority, any institution would not put some risk assessment in place to ensure that for Lee's own safety and for the safety of people around him, that at least his medication would be supervised until he took his last breath. Surely Tim's life is worth that investment. Take care, guys. Let me know your thoughts. Obviously, our prayers are with the family. It's a really conflicting case. Give me a comment. Let me know whether you agree that the right thing happened and the right advice was followed and Lee's been allowed to just get on with his world and his life, or whether you too feel that Tim's life required a legacy where supervision took place, so that if there is ever another opportunity where we see Lee sliding from reality into psychosis, someone will be there to catch him when he falls, so that he can't hurt anyone else ever again, including himself. Take care, guys. Be safe.